There is a town in Alberta that can only be reached for most of the year by airplane. It has been continuously inhabited since 1788. Most Albertans couldn't find it on a map. There's a town of 29 people you can only access by crossing 11 single-lane bridges, where the only business is a bar that's been serving drinks since 1913 and still has framed bullet holes on the wall from an argument over an unpaid tab. There's a hamlet where 12 people preserved an entire 1930s prairie community and once a month open the saloon to serve pizza to hundreds of strangers who drive 2 hours specifically for it. There's a town named after breakfast cereal. There's one with a government-approved alien landing pad. There's a community built entirely for one industry that half died and took half the town with it. Alberta is 661,000 square kilometers, bigger than France. Most people who've lived here their whole lives have seen 3% of it. The QE2, the mountains on weekends, Drumheller once. The rest exists in a kind of negative space. It's out there. Nobody goes. 10 towns, 1 province, none of them in the tourism brochure. We're going to the places that didn't make it. Number 10, Cereal, Alberta. There is a town in eastern Alberta called Cereal. Take a moment with that. Not named after a person with the surname Cereal, not a translation from Cree or Blackfoot or Ukrainian, not an acronym, not a local legend, not a misprint that stuck. The town is called Cereal because the settlers who arrived in 1909 were grain farmers, and when it came time to name the post office, someone looked at the fields of wheat stretching to the horizon and decided that calling it what it was seemed reasonable. It is a decision that has haunted the town's tourism identity and aided it in equal measure for 115 years. Population today, roughly 130 people. The number fluctuates by season and by year, in a direction that has generally been one way for several decades. What Cereal has, physically, a curling rink that fills up on winter evenings, a community hall that gets used for events more regularly than its size would suggest, a fire hall staffed by volunteers, a hockey rink, a school that still has students in it, and a sky that reminds you the planet is round in a way that cities never do. What Cereal doesn't have: a grocery store, a gas station with reliable hours, a bar, a single major employer, or a compelling answer to the question that anyone under 30 eventually asks themselves when they're here. The town sits in the special areas, a designation that requires some explanation. The special areas were created during the 1930s, when drought and depression emptied the southeastern Alberta plains so thoroughly and so fast that the provincial government took over direct administration of the land. There simply weren't enough functioning municipalities left to govern themselves. The provincial government stepped in and has been running it as a hybrid public-private arrangement ever since. This administrative structure, created during a catastrophe nearly a century ago, still governs Cereal today. What that tells you is something about the land itself. This part of Alberta has been at the edge of viability for farming since the dryland settlers arrived and gambled their futures on annual precipitation levels that turned out to be far less reliable than the promotional pamphlets from Winnipeg had suggested. The people who stayed after the Dirty 30s were not people who hadn't considered leaving. They were people who looked at the same landscape that defeated their neighbors and decided to approach it differently. Cereal is weird in the way that prairie persistence is always slightly weird. The math doesn't fully support the conclusion, but the conclusion keeps happening anyway. 130 people in a town named after breakfast cereal in the middle of one of the driest corners of a province famous for its oil, holding curling bonspiels in January and maintaining a fire hall nobody outside a 50-kilometer radius will ever use. Someone put a sign near the highway recently that read, "Cereal, we've got milk." Whether that was official or not, the town hasn't confirmed. The town also hasn't denied it. Number 9, Vegreville, Alberta. In 1974, the town of Vegreville commissioned the world's largest Ukrainian Easter egg. Read that sentence as many times as you need. Not a mural, not a cultural center or a heritage plaque or a bronze statue in a park, a 9-meter tall, 2,270-kilogram aluminum Easter egg designed using a computer algorithm developed by a University of Alberta structural engineer, fabricated from 524 anodized aluminum panels arranged in a mathematically precise pattern of gold, silver, and bronze, mounted on a 3-point rotating base so it turns in the wind like an enormous jeweled gyroscope visible from the highway for several kilometers in every direction. The egg took 2 years to complete. It cost $24,000 in 1974 money. It has its own engineering documentation and its own Wikipedia page. On a clear day, it is the most striking object in an extremely flat landscape for roughly 40 kilometers in either direction. Here's what the egg isn't. It isn't a joke. It isn't ironic. It isn't isn't the sort of thing a community builds when it's running out of ideas and needs a roadside attraction. Vegreville built the Pysanka because the Ukrainian-Canadian community of Alberta needed to leave a mark, and they needed it to be permanent. Ukrainian settlers arrived in this region in the 1890s and early 1900s in enormous numbers, recruited by the Dominion government with promises of free homestead land that turned out to require a level of labor, isolation, and winter survival that the promotional materials hadn't fully communicated. They came from the Galicia and Bukovina regions of what is now Western Ukraine, speaking a language the Canadian mainstream didn't consider worth learning, practicing an Orthodox faith that mainstream Protestant Canada treated with a suspicion it reserves for things it doesn't understand. They broke the prairie. They built communities. They established churches that are still standing. They buried children in frozen ground and named the towns after places they'd never see again. The egg was built because a community that had been in Canada for 80 years and still felt like it was fighting to be taken seriously decided that the most lasting thing it could do was plant a 9-meter monument in the ground that nobody could ignore and nobody could move. Population of Vegreville today is around 5,500. The churches are still active. The Pysanka Festival every summer draws visitors from across Western Canada. The Ukrainian Orthodox cultural fabric of the region is still visible if you know where to look. But here's what the egg can't protect against. The Ukrainian language is fading. The generation that commissioned the Pysanka as a survival statement is aging out. Their grandchildren speak English as a first language and Ukrainian, if at all, as a heritage project rather than a living tongue. The egg stands in an unchanged landscape as the living culture it was built to commemorate becomes something different. There are communities in this province that built things meant to last forever as a way of insisting their story mattered. The thing lasts. The story underneath it changes. What the community is becoming, nobody inside it has fully agreed on yet. The egg keeps turning in the wind either way. Number 8. Hanna, Alberta. Let's not waste time getting to the obvious part. Hanna, Alberta. Population approximately 2,600, located in east-central Alberta, roughly equidistant between Drumheller and the Saskatchewan border, is internationally known as the hometown of Nickelback, the band, the most reliably mocked act in the history of internet music culture. The band that became a punchline so durable and so widely shared that it has outlasted most of the actual critics who invented it and shows no signs of retirement. Nickelback has sold over 50 million albums worldwide. They are one of the best-selling Canadian musical acts of all time. They are also, in certain corners of the internet, treated as evidence of civilizational decline. Both of these things are simultaneously true, and Hanna has chosen, wisely, to lean into both of them. There is a Nickelback mural on a building in downtown Hanna. The band is referenced in the town's tourism materials. When journalists arrived to write the mandatory "We visited Nickelback's hometown" piece, which happens with a regularity that suggests editors consider it a reliable content format, Hanna provides a tour and makes itself available. The pieces that result almost always focus on the mural and the jokes, and miss what's actually happening in Hanna, which is considerably more interesting than a mural. Hanna was built on coal mining and dryland agriculture. Both industries have contracted, automated, and centralized over the past 4 decades in ways that have emptied downtown storefronts and reversed population growth across east-central Alberta. Hanna is not uniquely affected. It is part of a regional pattern that runs from here to Wainwright to the Saskatchewan border, a slow hollowing of towns that were built for an agricultural economy that no longer requires as many people as it used to. The downtown has vacancies. The demographics skew older each census. Young people leave for Red Deer and Calgary at rates that every local institution is aware of and that nobody has found a solution for. Now, in this context, consider the mural. A town that makes itself memorable for any reason, even a ridiculous one, generates visitors. Visitors enter businesses. Businesses stay open. Open businesses contribute to a community that looks like a place where things happen, which makes it more likely that it will continue to be a place where things happen. This is not a complicated mechanism. It's the same logic that built the world's largest Easter egg in Vegreville and the UFO landing pad you'll hear about shortly. The towns in Alberta that are declining fastest are not the ones that leaned into a gimmick. They're the ones that had no gimmick, no story, no reason for a stranger to drive an hour off the highway to look at them. Hanna has a reason. It's a band that half the internet has decided to hate. That's still a reason. The question nobody asks during those journalist visits, if Nickelback had been from Drumheller instead, what would Hanna have right now? Number 7. Grande Cache, Alberta. Most towns grow because someone found a reason to be there. Grande Cache was different. Grande Cache was built. In 1969, the provincial government and a coal company looked at a section of the Rocky Mountain foothills at 1,200 meters elevation, roughly 460 kilometers northwest of Edmonton, surrounded by peaks and boreal forest with no road connection to the outside world, and decided to construct a town. Not a camp, not a temporary worksite, a town. Streets, sidewalks, a hospital, an arena, a school, a main street with actual businesses, a town site laid out on a grid with the expectation of permanence. A highway was then constructed specifically to reach it because the town existed before the road did. The reason was metallurgical coal in the mountains. Coal used in steel production, in demand, extractable. The mine required workers. Workers required infrastructure. The infrastructure required planning. The planning produced Grande Cache. Population peaked around 4,500 in the 1980s. The coal market, however, is not a stable thing. Global steel demand fluctuates. Mine ownership changed hands multiple times. Closures happened. Partial reopenings followed. Further contractions followed those. Each cycle pulled people south to Edmonton and Calgary, where other industries offered more predictable employment. The hospital closed. That is the data point that tells you the most about a small community's trajectory. Not the storefronts, not the school enrollment, not the real estate listings, the hospital. When a community can no longer sustain a hospital, it is no longer able to absorb certain kinds of risk. Today, Grande Cache has roughly 3,500 people. The number doesn't fully capture the situation. The situation is better captured by the infrastructure. A town built for 4,500, serving 3,500, with the maintenance costs of the larger number and the tax base of the smaller. The arena seats more people than attend the games. The roads are wide enough for a traffic volume that hasn't existed in years. The buildings are large in ways that make the emptiness inside them legible from outside. Grande Cache is wearing clothes from when it was heavier. It knows this. Here's what its own residents will tell you, unprompted, when you ask why they stayed. The Wilmore Wilderness Park begins at the edge of town. 4,597 square kilometers of backcountry with no motorized access whatsoever. Horse trails and hiking routes through terrain that hasn't been meaningfully altered since before the coal company drew up the townsite plan. Elk populations large enough to affect local driving. Wolves. Mountain goats on ridges above the highway. An aurora, at this latitude and this distance from any urban light pollution, that operates at a scale photographs consistently underrepresent. The people who are still in Grande Cache are not people who don't know about Calgary. They went. They came back. Or they looked at what they'd have to give up and decided against the trade. Both of those are considered deliberate positions. A town built with an expiration date, still running well past when the calculus said it should have emptied. That's a specific kind of stubbornness that deserves its own category. Number 6. Cardston, Alberta. Drive south from Lethbridge on Highway 2. The Rockies rise on your right, close enough to feel like a wall rather than a backdrop. The land flattens into something that feels almost oceanic. Wind turbines on the horizon, the occasional hawk standing on a fence post looking like a small executive. Then, in a town of about 3,500 people that the majority of Albertans couldn't locate on a map without assistance, a white granite temple rises above the roofline of everything around it. The Cardston, Alberta Temple of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints was completed in 1923. It was the first LDS temple built outside the United States. It is classified as a National Historic Site of Canada. On approach from several directions, it is visible before the town is, which was presumably intentional and which produces an effect in visitors that ranges from impressed to unsettled, depending on the visitor. Cardston was founded in 1887 by Charles Ora Card, son-in-law of Brigham Young. Card led a wagon company of Mormon settlers north from Utah specifically to find territory outside American jurisdiction, where federal anti-polygamy legislation wouldn't reach. They crossed into what was then the Northwest Territories, claimed land on the banks of Lee Creek, and started building. The community they built has been continuously LDS in character for nearly 140 years. What that means practically today. Cardston is dry. No bars, no liquor stores, no licensed restaurants. If you want alcohol, the drive to Lethbridge is about 45 minutes. The social infrastructure of the community runs through the church in ways that most secular Canadian towns haven't maintained for generations. Youth programming, service organizations, community networks that activate quickly when a family has a problem. The volunteerism rate is high. The crime rate is among the lowest in the province. The community's internal cohesion is visible in the physical condition of the town. Here's what that coherence was built on top of. The Kainai Nation, known also as the Blood Tribe, has the largest First Nations reserve by land area in Canada, directly adjacent to Cardston. The reserve is larger than the town. The relationship between the Kainai people and the LDS settlers who arrived in 1887 has never been simple and has never fully resolved. The settlers came to land that was Blackfoot territory by treaty. The dynamics that followed were shaped by the same forces that shaped indigenous settler relations across the entire West, complicated in Cardston's case by the specific insularity of a tight religious community building its institutions specifically to be separate from outside influence. These two communities have coexisted for over a century, and the history between them is not the history the temple suggests when you see it from the highway. The temple is real, the community is real. The history underneath both of them requires more than a day to begin to understand. Number 5. Wayne, Alberta. The argument for Wayne begins before you arrive. You turn off Highway 10 outside Drumheller and the Badlands start immediately. The coulees close in from both sides, the hoodoos appear on ridges above you, standing in clusters like things that are meant to be something else and stopped halfway through the process. The road narrows, the signs stop suggesting alternative routes, and then you come around a bend and there is a single-lane wooden bridge over the Rosebud River, and you cross it. Then there's another one, and another. By the time you've crossed 9 bridges, all of them single lane, all of them wooden, all of them speaking to a construction philosophy that prioritized function over either speed or comfort, something has changed about your relationship to where you're going. You've been filtered. The 11 bridges to Wayne are not an engineering oversight. They are a selection mechanism. Anyone who doesn't genuinely want to be in Wayne will have turned around by Bridge 4. Population of Wayne today, 29 people. The number has held around there for long enough that the locals have stopped finding it remarkable. Wayne peaked at 2,500 residents in the 1920s, when 12 coal mines were running in the coulees around it. The town was not, by any surviving account, a peaceful or well-organized community during its peak. The workforce was drawn heavily from the United States, and with it came the organized political conflicts of the American labor movement. The Communist Party had strong roots among the miners. The Ku Klux Klan, imported from south of the border, burned crosses on the hillsides above town. Mine operators played different immigrant and political groups against each other with the practiced efficiency of people who had learned this technique in other company towns first. The last mine closed in 1957. Nearly everyone left in a period that locals describe with a precision that suggests it happened fast, as a matter of months rather than years. What stayed was the Last Chance Saloon, originally called the Bucket of Blood. The name came from the frequency of serious altercations inside it. At some point in its operational history, someone decided Bucket of Blood was perhaps not the most reassuring name for a drinking establishment, and renamed it The Last Chance, which is accurate in a different way given the surrounding context of 29 people and 11 bridges. The saloon has been serving drinks continuously since 1913. On the wall, framed behind glass, are 3 bullet holes. The story attached to them? A bartender, facing 3 customers who refused to pay their tabs, produced a firearm and fired 3 shots over their heads. The customers paid. The bullet holes were preserved as institutional memory. Jackie Chan filmed scenes from Shanghai Noon here. Clint Eastwood shot portions of Unforgiven in the coulees surrounding Wayne. Both productions arrived because the landscape was exactly what it looked like: untouched, unmodernized, and thoroughly itself. On weekend afternoons, the Last Chance Saloon is full of people who drove from Drumheller, Hanna, and Calgary to sit in a room that has been the same room, more or less, for over 100 years. The bridges haven't been widened. They haven't been replaced with something more convenient. Wayne receives visitors in exactly the same way it has always received visitors. One at a time, on a single lane, crossing a river 11 times to get there. Number 4. St. Paul, Alberta. In 1967, Canada was celebrating its centennial, and every community in the country was encouraged to undertake a project to mark the occasion. The federal government provided guidance. Communities planted trees, erected cairns, built parks, and installed public art. The standard repertoire of Canadian civic celebration. St. Paul, a town of approximately 5,000 people in the northeastern Alberta parkland, built a landing pad for extraterrestrial spacecraft. This was not a decision made without government awareness. The 100 130-ton concrete platform elevated above ground on a circular base was an officially designated centennial project with a letter of endorsement from a federal cabinet minister. The platform was unveiled with ceremony. A time capsule was buried beneath it. A plaque was installed declaring the airspace above St. Paul open to visitors of all planets and all points of origin, with a specific assurance of peaceful intent on behalf of the community. The Guinness World Records has certified it as the world's first officially constructed UFO landing pad. There is a visitor center adjacent to the pad. The exhibit inside covers documented UFO sightings, crop formations, cattle mutilation reports, and unexplained aerial events. The town operates a 24-hour toll-free sighting hotline, staffed and maintained. The number is 1-888-CUFOS. This is not a historical artifact from 1967. The hotline is active. The official municipal position on extraterrestrial visitors, as communicated in town tourism materials. They will be welcomed with pierogies, garlic sausage, and pea soup. Here is the part of this story that resists easy categorization. Whether the 1967 project was serious, satirical, or strategically calculated as a tourism play is genuinely unclear. The proposal appears to have been partly humorous and partly sincere, in the way that things in small prairie towns sometimes are both simultaneously. The federal government approved it, which is either evidence that the government understood the joke, or evidence that nobody in Ottawa was paying close enough attention to object. What is not unclear is the regional context. The area of northeastern Alberta that includes St. Paul, Cold Lake, Lac La Biche, and the corridor toward Fort McMurray generates a disproportionate volume of UFO sighting reports filed with civilian research organizations and government tracking bodies. This is documented. The explanations that have been offered include military flight operations from the Cold Lake Air Weapons Range, industrial light and atmospheric disturbance from oil sands activity, low-altitude satellite orbital paths, and atmospheric inversion phenomena over the boreal forest. These explanations are reasonable. They account for most of the reports. St. Paul does not tell visitors which reports it believes the explanations account for and which ones it doesn't. The town builds the landing pad, maintains the hotline, prepares the pierogies, and lets the question stay open. As community positions on fundamental uncertainty go, it is one of the more dignified ones. Number 3. Empress, Alberta. Here is how Empress looks at 3 o'clock on a Wednesday afternoon in October. You drive in on a grid road that the GPS has warned you about 3 times with words like unverified and local conditions may vary. The town appears gradually, the way things appear in flat country, first as a water tower on the horizon, then as roof lines, then as streets that are organized as streets but contain fewer buildings than the lot line suggests they should. There is grass growing through the outlines of foundations where houses used to be. The grid extends past the occupied blocks in directions where there is currently nothing to indicate habitation. Population 128, give or take, depending on the year and on whether you're counting the people who have technically moved but still receive mail. Empress sits at the confluence of the Red Deer River and the South Saskatchewan River, at the very southeastern tip of Alberta, where the province runs out of road and drops into Saskatchewan. Medicine Hat is 160 kilometers west. The nearest traffic light is further than that. The town incorporated in 1914 when a CPR branch line ran through it. The standard package arrived: grain elevator, hotel, general store, post office, a main street with a function. Farmers from the surrounding region used it as a service stop. Population peaked somewhere around 400, which is not large by any measure, but is 3 times what it is now. The branch line was abandoned. The grain elevator closed. The school closed. In a year that locals can tell you exactly, and that comes up in conversations about Empress with a frequency that suggests it was the moment people started leaving faster. The young people went to Medicine Hat and Calgary. The older people died or moved for medical reasons. Then the cycle repeated in the next generation, and the generation after that. What is left in Empress is not technically a ghost town. There are people. There is an operating post office, which means Canada Post has calculated that the community qualifies for mail delivery, a determination that functions as a kind of federal census of minimum viability. There is a community hall, and it is used. The properties that are occupied are maintained, but the properties that are not occupied outnumber the ones that are. Here's the thing about Empress that the decline numbers don't convey. The confluence of the Red Deer River and the South Saskatchewan, viewed from the hillside above town in the long light of an October afternoon, is a genuinely remarkable piece of geography. The Badlands erosion along both river valleys creates formations that would anchor a provincial park somewhere with a better marketing apparatus. The 2 rivers meeting in the valley below, wide and slow and reflecting the prairie sky back at you, is the kind of landscape that costs nothing to see and that most Albertans have never seen. The people who remain in Empress, all 128 of them or however many there are this year, are not people who don't know about Medicine Hat. They've been there. They've considered it. They looked at the confluence of two rivers and the big sky and the deep quiet and ran the numbers differently than everyone who left did. Whether Empress is at a temporary low point in a longer story or at its final chapter is a question nobody in the town will answer for you. That restraint too is a kind of answer. Number 2, Rowley, Alberta. 12 people live in Rowley. Before we go further, sit with the specific number. Not 12 families, not 12 households, 12 individual human beings living in a preserved 1930s prairie community in the Badlands region west of Drumheller, maintaining structures that have been standing since before any of them were born, in a location that most GPS systems treat with a level of hesitation usually reserved for unmarked fire roads. Rowley peaked at approximately 500 residents in the 1920s. Coal in the area, rail access, a functional economy. When the coal declined and the rail contracted and the economy reorganized itself around centers with better highway access, people left, at the rate that people always leave these places. Quickly at first, then in a slower trickle that eventually reduces a community to the people who genuinely cannot imagine being elsewhere. By the time the population had contracted to the current figure, the usual outcome in Alberta ghost town geography would be buildings collapse or are demolished, the land reverts to agricultural or municipal control, the name stays on older maps, and the place becomes a paragraph in a local history book. That didn't happen in Rowley. The 12 people who live there have spent decades, collectively, maintaining the original pioneer structures, the church, the bank, the general store, with period-appropriate products still on the shelves, the schoolhouse, the barber shop with its original chair still bolted to the floor, the saloon, Sam's Saloon, which has a functioning pool table and a wood stove and walls that have not been significantly altered in orientation or intention since they were built. This is not a museum. There is no admission fee. There is no Heritage Society receiving primary government funding to maintain these buildings. There are 12 people who have decided, apparently without extensive deliberation, that this place should not disappear and that they are the people responsible for making sure it doesn't. Here is the specific mechanism they've developed for keeping it alive. Every last Saturday of the month, they open Sam's Saloon and they make pizza. They bring in ovens, source ingredients, and serve full meals in a preserved 1930s saloon to hundreds of people who drive from Drumheller and Red Deer and Calgary specifically for this. The parking area outside Rowley on last Saturdays holds cars from at least 3 provinces. On the inside, the pool table is occupied and the wood stove is going, and the building is doing what buildings do when they're being used. It's being a building. Consider what the alternative looks like. If the 12 people had decided the maintenance was too much, the buildings would have collapsed within a generation. The land would be an empty field outside Drumheller with a name in old records. Nobody would ever mention Rowley in a conversation. There would be nothing there to mention. Instead, there is a functional 1930s saloon in an intact prairie ghost town where it is impossible to get a seat on pizza night, operated by 12 people who will tell you, without apparent irony, that they just didn't want to see the buildings fall down. 12 people. 1 pizza night per month, and a town that should have disappeared 50 years ago and chose not to. That is not a heritage project. That is an argument. Number 1, Fort Chipewyan, Alberta. Fort Chipewyan is the oldest continuously inhabited European settlement in Alberta. Established in 1788 by the Northwest Company as a fur trade post on the western shore of Lake Athabasca. 236 years of continuous habitation. Alexander Mackenzie departed from Fort Chipewyan in 1789 on the expedition that reached the Arctic Ocean 102 days later. He returned and departed again in 1793 on the overland route that brought him to the Pacific Ocean, completing the first documented transcontinental crossing of North America north of Mexico. Both expeditions left from what is now a community of approximately 1,200 people that the majority of Albertans have never heard of. Here is the access situation. There is no all-season road connecting Fort Chipewyan to the provincial highway network. Let that sentence land before continuing. For most of the year, the only way to reach Fort Chipewyan from anywhere with a paved road is by small aircraft. Scheduled air service runs from Fort McMurray, approximately 250 kilometers south. The flight takes about 45 minutes and costs considerably more than equivalent distance flights with competition on the route, because there is no competition on this route. If you need to fly out for a medical appointment and the weather is marginal, you wait. If you need emergency evacuation and conditions are bad enough to ground aircraft, aircraft, the conversation that follows is very serious. In winter, when Lake Athabasca freezes to sufficient depth, an ice road opens. The provincial government maintains it. It typically operates from January to March, depending on temperatures and ice stability. The crossing spans sections of the lake where there is no visible land in any direction for the entirety of the route. Trucks use it to bring in supplies at prices that reflect a year of air freight markups temporarily replaced by something more affordable. Residents use it to drive south for things the town doesn't carry, which is many things. When the ice road closes in spring, the cost of a bag of flour in Fort Chipewyan returns to its air freight price point. Now here's the part the isolation narrative misses. The Cree and Dene peoples have lived around Lake Athabasca for thousands of years before the Northwest Company arrived in 1788. The Mikisew Cree First Nation and the Athabasca Chipewyan First Nation both have their administrative headquarters in Fort Chipewyan. The majority of the town's residents are members of these nations. Fort Chipewyan is not a European settlement that survived into the modern era against the odds. It is a First Nations community that absorbed a European trading post into a continuity that predates the trading post by several millennia. The difference matters. It explains why Fort Chipewyan is not dying, not waiting for rescue, not particularly interested in the narrative of remote community decline that the access situation would seem to imply. The community has outlasted the fur trade, the Dominion government, several policy frameworks explicitly designed to concentrate remote indigenous populations into larger centers, and multiple rounds of political debate about whether the ice road is worth maintaining. It is still there. Lake Athabasca is 7,935 square kilometers of fresh water. In summer, it is an inland sea. The Peace Athabasca Delta, where the Peace and Athabasca rivers meet the lake in a wetland complex of 3,800 square kilometers, is one of the largest inland freshwater deltas in the world, and one of the most significant migratory bird staging areas on the continent. Wood Buffalo National Park, the largest national park in Canada at 44,807 square kilometers, begins at the edge of town. Wood bison, whooping cranes, wolf territories that extend further than some provinces. The Aurora Borealis at 58 degrees north latitude, 100 kilometers from the nearest city of any size, in winter air that is clear because there is nothing between you and the Arctic to put anything into it, performs at a scale that photographs do not communicate. This is not a matter of camera equipment or skill, it is a matter of dimension. The aurora over Fort Chipewyan takes up a portion of the sky that you don't have a frame of reference for until you've been inside it. The catches at Fort Chipewyan are real, and they are serious. The cost of living is substantially higher than anywhere connected to the provincial highway network. The doctor shortage affecting rural Alberta generally is acute in Fort Chipewyan specifically. The social challenges associated with decades of federal underfunding and policy instability in remote northern Indigenous communities are present here, as they are in communities across the north. These are not footnotes, they are the central facts of daily life for many people who live there, but they are not the whole story, and they are not where the story ends. In 1789, Alexander Mackenzie reached the mouth of the river that now bears his name and wrote in his journal that he had arrived at a river of disappointment because it had taken him to the Arctic Ocean rather than the Pacific. He had spent 102 days in a canoe and reached the wrong ocean. He came back to Fort Chipewyan. He planned a second expedition. He left again in 1793 and this time reached the Pacific, completing a crossing that wouldn't be repeated until Lewis and Clark 12 years later. Fort Chipewyan is the place he kept leaving from and kept coming back to. It was the oldest European settlement in Alberta in 1793. It is the oldest European settlement in Alberta in 2024. It will likely still be the oldest European settlement in Alberta in 2024, because the thing about Fort Chipewyan is that it was here before almost everything else in this province and has outlasted most of what came after. It is the most isolated community on this list. It is also the most historically significant. It is the one place in Alberta that most Albertans have never visited and that most Albertans, if they did, would not forget. The ice road opens in January. The flights run daily from Fort McMurray. The aurora, when it moves, takes up the whole sky. 10 towns, 1 province, and somewhere in this list, a place you didn't know existed an hour ago that you're already thinking about visiting. Drop it in the comments. We'll be back.